The following program is a production of Truth for the World.
Day by day, and with each passing moment, strength I find to meet my trials here, trusting in my Father's wise bestowment. I've no cause for worry or for fear.
I believe that one of the first passages that came to my mind, or that comes to my mind in talking about this subject this afternoon, is located in the first part of the book of James. And in James 1, beginning in verse 13, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God tempteth no man, neither can he be tempted with evil. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. And lust, when it is conceived, bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. I believe that's the scriptural development of how sin develops in the life of an individual. And so we're not to blame God when we are tempted. We're to look within our own heart, within our own soul, and determine why we give in to the lustful demands of the flesh or the lustful demands of peer pressure. This afternoon, I want to talk about some common misconceptions about temptation, and then I want to spend most of our time in talking about keys that will help us to keep from yielding to temptation. In regard to common misconceptions, first of all, some people try to make the two terms, temptations and sin, into synonymous terms, and they really are not that. If they mean one and the same, then look where that places the Lord Jesus Christ. We're told in Hebrews 4 and verse 15 that he was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. The Bible teaches that he faced temptation. In fact, when Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew in chapter 4 and Luke in chapter 4 and Mark in chapter 1 talked about the temptations of Jesus at the hands of the arch-enemy of mankind, namely Satan. They referred to these as temptations. He was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the Savior, or the Satan, by the arch-enemy of mankind. And yet he did not give in to any of the demands or any of the enticements that Satan tried to place before him. And so there's a difference between temptation and sin. A person may be tempted and may yield to that temptation, and thus it constitutes sin in his life or her life. A person may be tempted to do something that is wrong and then recognizes, no, that would be against my God and his religion. That would be against the very thing that I've lived my life in harmony with, and I'm not going to participate in that evil. Has he been tempted? Has she been tempted? Yes. Has the person sinned? No, it's not so, because the person has not given in to sin. I believe the song that we sometimes sing, Yield Not to Temptation, answers our question, for yielding is sin. It is in the yielding to that temptation that sin actually develops and actually becomes a great hindrance to us in our living the Christian life. Another misconception that people have in regard to temptation, some people evidently think that there's no such thing as sin in the world. We had to fight modernism for a long, long time, which is a rejection of the inspiration of the Bible, a rejection of the supernatural, a rejection of the miraculous in the Bible. Now we're having to fight the battle of what they call postmodernism, and it is a very insidious enemy. It's a rejection of authority. It simply suggests to every person that he or she has the right to craft his or her own religion, that there really isn't anything wrong in what a person decides to do, and about the only thing that they find any wrong in is if we oppose something, and thus they conclude that we're being intolerant people, that we do not tolerate that which is wrong and sinful. But they've just about erased sin from the consciousness of mankind. And then there's the Pat Boone philosophy. I was in school at Lipscomb the same time Pat Boone was. We sat in the same Bible classes. We listened to the same chapel addresses. And yet in the 1960s, he decided to leave the church and go into Pentecostalism. Of course, he was a popular young singer and had many young people viewing him as one of the great examples of Christianity. And he was hailed widely as a fine example of a young Christian man. And yet later he forsook the truth and went into Pentecostalism or the charismatic movement. And then some years back he wrote a book entitled A Miracle a Day Keeps the Devil Away. That's a misunderstanding of how we deal with the devil, and it's a misunderstanding of how temptation actually works in our life. Jesus had the power to perform miraculously. Matthew 4, Luke 4, and Mark the first chapter. And yet he did not operate miraculously in meeting the devil, whether it be turning stones into bread. And it would have been just as easy for him to have turned those Palestinian stones into bread as it later was for him to take a few pieces of bread and a small amount of fish and turn them into a vast amount of food capable of feeding thousands and thousands of people. But he was not going to give in to that demand. And he did not give in to the demand that he fall down and worship Satan, or that he cast himself down from the pinnacle top of the temple, gliding safely to the ground. Jesus was not going to do that. And I've often thought that if he had performed miraculously in each one of these three temptations, it would not have been an example for us to pursue or emulate, because we do not possess miraculous power. None of us is possessive of supernatural power today as the Lord was. But he did something that is able, that is capable of, that is something that we can use. Whenever we're tempted, we can go to the word of the Lord, as Jesus did upon the occasions in Matthew 4, Luke 4, and Mark the first chapter. And so it's a misconception upon the part of Pat Boone to suggest that a miracle a day keeps the devil away. And since we do not have miraculous today, regardless of Boone and others who contend that we do, obviously we would not have that weapon at our risk for our help today. But the main part of the lesson this afternoon, I want to deal with some keys that I believe will help us to refuse yielding to temptation, knowing that the yielding actually constitutes the sin or the transgression. First of all, avoid evil companionships. This is actually suggested as one of the lyrics in the well-known song, Yield Not to Temptation. And then mention is made against associating with those who are evil, those who are wicked, those who are filled with iniquity. In the early chapters of the book of Proverbs, Solomon being the penman of that book, he warned his son about evil communications, warning him not to associate with those who were dishonest, those who would kill, those who would destroy, those who would steal from other people. And quite often in the early chapters, he warns him about the evil woman and the enticements that she might present before him, suggesting that he flee from that kind of situation. And so Solomon gives some excellent advice and counsel. Too bad he didn't follow that himself in connection with the wives that he had, allowing them to win himself away from God and in the direction of idolatry, as we see in 1 Kings, the 11th chapter. But evil communications corrupt good morals or good manners, as we see in 1 Corinthians 15 and 33. And the Bible tells us in Ephesians 5 and verse 11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. In Genesis, the 6th chapter, we read about the sons of God who were enamored with the beauty of women, the daughters of men, and there were marriages that were contracted between the two. Sons of God there do not refer to angelic beings, as some have contended. It refers, I believe, to righteous men, the righteous sons, and they became enamored with the physical beauty of the daughters of men, with marriages developing, with a result that we find in Genesis, the 6th chapter, when men became so evil-minded that they could not even form a good thought. Every imagination of the thought and intent of the heart was evil, and evil continually. They had chosen the wrong kinds of people, and that is necessary if we are to refrain from yielding to sin, that we not associate with those who are evil-minded. And then another thing that will help us immensely in this matter is, as the song directs, bad language disdain. Do not take the name of the Lord in vain. In fact, one of the commandments of the Old Testament, one of the commandments of the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandment law, was, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. God respected his name. He loved his name. And he did not intend for man, his creature, to come along and to take that name in vain, to curse him, and to take his name and use it flippantly, as many people have continued to do through the passing of the years. And then we're told in the New Testament, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace to the hearer. Ephesians 4 and verse 29. And then we're told in Colossians, the 4th chapter and verse 6, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. I remember preaching in a gospel meeting up in eastern Ohio a number of years ago with a Quaker City congregation. I held a number of gospel meetings in that area and continue to go back from time to time. But I mentioned in one of the Sunday morning lessons, back in those days, we ran meetings for 2 weeks or more, and I think this one ran for about 15 or 16 days altogether. And in one of the Sunday morning lessons, I mentioned something about the practice of cursing, taking the name of the Lord in vain. And there was a young man in the audience that morning, and he was in the construction business. And he delayed a little bit after the others had gone. And he said, Brother Taylor, I have built houses and business places in many areas here in eastern Ohio. And I am associated every day with people who tell me, now I cannot build a house, I cannot help renovate a house without taking the name of the Lord in vain when something goes wrong. He says, I have never taken the name of my God in vain in all of the many years that I've been in the construction business. And I've never forgotten that. A person can do his work and still not take the name of the Lord in vain when something goes wrong. And so, bad language disdain. And then we need to form friends that will help us and that will be an inspiration to us. If I remember correctly, Brother Elkins referred to Jonathan and David. And the Bible tells us in 1 Samuel 23 and 16 that Jonathan went out to David in the wooded section and strengthened his hand in God. This was a particularly dangerous time for David. He was rather depressed. He was hunted as though he were an incorrigible outlaw by Saul, the king of the land, and he needed the help and the encouragement of his good friend Jonathan. And their friendship had begun shortly after the great victory that David won over Goliath. And their souls were knitted as though they were one. And it was a lifetime of beautiful friendship and fellowship and companionship between the two of them. They loved and respected each other deeply. And Jonathan certainly went against the wishes and the better interest of his own father, or at least what the father considered his better interest, and still retaining a friendship and companionship with David. And yet, here upon this occasion, he strengthened his hand in God. Not only should we try to make friends who will strengthen our hands in God, but that's the kind of friend that we ought to be to other people. We ought to strengthen their hands in God. David was fortunate in having a friend of that description. Barnabas is mentioned so favorably in the New Testament, and he was certainly a person that strengthen the hands of others in God. He was willing to help the Apostle Paul shortly after his conversion when he came to Jerusalem for the first time, and went to bat for him, suggesting that he had seen the Lord and that he had already begun to preach favorably and fervently and faithfully the gospel of the Son of God in the Damascus city, in the city of Damascus. And so Barnabas was one who was willing to strengthen the hand of another individual. On the first missionary journey that Paul and Barnabas took, Acts 13, they took with them for a part of the journey John Mark, a young man. But John Mark did not continue that journey with them. He returned to the city of Jerusalem. And when they began to make preparation for the second missionary journey, Barnabas was determined that John Mark should go, and Paul was determined that he should not go. He did not go with us to the work, and I'm not willing to take a shirker on our second journey together. And the contention was so sharp that they separated company from each other. Paul and Silas going one direction, Barnabas and John Mark going another direction. But Barnabas was willing to give John Mark another opportunity. I sometimes have wondered maybe if Barnabas had not suggested something like this to Paul. He said, "Paul, do you remember a number of years ago when you were not recognized and when you were not being accepted by the brethren in Jerusalem, and I went to bat for you?" I think Barnabas is to be commended because he wanted to give John Mark a second opportunity, a second chance. And later on, Paul would say in regard to John Mark, "Bring Mark with you, for he is profitable to me for the ministry." And so he's a great example of one who strengthened the hands of others in the God of heaven. But I believe something else that will help us in resisting temptation is to fill our mind and our heart with that which is good and that which is acceptable and that which is holy in the sight of God. It was Jesus who taught in Matthew 5 and verse 8, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Here is inward purity. And where there is inward purity of heart, that's going to trigger purity upon one's lips, as well as provide purity in the daily actions of an individual. It was in the Old Testament that we read to the effect that keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. And certainly that is very true. In talking about the matter that we are discussing now, this is the way that Paul expressed it in Philippians 4 and verse 8. "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things." And when a person is thinking on things like that, then it's going to be far easier to resist the temptations that come down the pike as we go through life. And so it is important, therefore, that we take into consideration purity of heart, an inward kind of purity. But I believe that another key would be closely akin to this, and that is fill our lives with good works. This is what Jesus had in mind in Matthew 5 and verse 16. "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." And the Apostle Paul suggested near the end of his life in writing to Titus, put them in mind to be subject to principalities, and then in the latter part of that verse, to be ready unto every good work. And then he suggested in Titus 3 verses 8 and 14 that good works are necessary and that they are profitable and that they are something that people ought to major in. And so filling our lives with that which is good and good works, I believe, is a good way to keep from sinning, to keep from yielding to the temptations of life. And then another thing that I believe is a very important key, and that is look for the way of escape. The Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 10 and 12, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. And then in the very next verse, there hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man, who is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape. I want to relate a little story that I heard in Nashville, Tennessee, a number of years ago. One of my teachers at Lipscomb, and when I went to school there in the early 50s, Lipscomb was a lot sounder than it is today. And I'm sad to say that as an alumnus of the school. But one of our teachers in class told us about something that had recently happened. Now, this was during the time of the Korean conflict in the early part of the 1950s. He related the story of a young man from the Charlotte Avenue congregation that was in service. I'm not sure which branch of service he might have been in. But he was on foreign soil. And one day some of the servicemen told him, we have obtained shore leave tonight, and we're going into town, and we're really going to paint the town red. They outlined some of the things that they intended to do, inclusive of drinking, inclusive of immorality and the like. And at first he said, I believe if I can get shore leave tonight, I'll go with you. And then it dawned on him that today is Wednesday. And at Wednesday night Bible study at Charlotte Avenue, when they pray, my dear loving Christian mother will be praying for her son in service. And as he thought about that, he could not engage in sin in a foreign country at the same time that his mother upon American soil was praying for his safety. He went to the men who had invited him and said, I'll not be going after all. He was tempted to go, but he had something that served as a lever. And I've often thought that maybe this was the Lord's provided way for him to get out of what would have been a sinful night of drinking, immorality, and illicit behavior and the like. And so there is a way of escape, and we need to be willing to find it. And then another thing that I believe will help us in resisting temptation and turning it into sin is learning how to say a definite and a permanent no. N-O. That's exactly what Joseph did in the Old Testament. Remember when he was a teenager, he was sold into captivity, Egyptian captivity, and there he came in contact with Potiphar's household, becoming a servant in Potiphar's household. And Potiphar's wife became enamored with a young, handsome Hebrew lad, and she began to make improper advances to him. And he said, no, I'm not going to do this kind of thing. How then can I sin against God and commit this awful thing? As she would say day by day, lie with me. And one time she became even more aggressive, caught his garment, and then he fled the scene. He thought more of his character than he did of his garment. There was a beauty winner a number of years ago who was asked the question, would she be willing to marry a man that she had never slept with? And she said, oh no, I wouldn't be willing to sleep with any man or marry any man that I had not been intimate with. She evidently thought less of her character than she should have. And in the case of Joseph, he thought more of his character than he did of the garment that he left in the woman's hand. But he knew how to say no to temptation. And then we have the case of Daniel in Daniel 1. He said no to what he and the others were facing in Babylonian captivity. The Babylonian people were not guided and governed by the Hebrew menu of what they could and could not eat. And of course, he was not willing to eat of the king's meat nor drink the king's wine. And he lived under a law that forbade that kind of thing. And as a result, he was blessed by the God of heaven. And then the three Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, said no to the invitation to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had made. They lived under a law that said, thou shalt not bow to a golden image, or thou shalt not make unto thee any images or any gods. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. They said a no, and they meant that no. It cost them a stay in the line, or rather in the furnace of fire. But as someone is suggesting, these three men would not bend, they would not bow, they would not break, and God saw to it that they would not burn either. They came forth from the flames of the fire without any smell of fire upon their person or upon their garments. They knew how to say no and mean it. And then Daniel in Daniel, the 6th chapter. And he's not a young man as he was in Daniel, the 1st chapter. He probably is in his 80s or 90s at the time. I've seen paintings of Daniel in the lion's den, and they portray him as being a young man. But he would have to have been in his 80s or 90s at the time that this occurred. He was in the Babylonian captivity period for a full 70 years, and this is now the Medo-Persian Empire era when this happens in Daniel, the 6th chapter. But there is a decree that is signed that no one is to lift a prayer to anybody except the king for the next 30 days. Well, he had the habit of praying 3 times a day. That would mean 90 prayerful sessions in which he would not participate, and he was not about to do that. He said a loud and decisive no and continued to pray as he formerly had done. Cost him a stay in the lion's den, but the Lord sent down an angel that stopped the lion's mouth, and he left it completely unharmed. He knew how to say no and to mean it. And I think this is one of the most important words that we can teach our children, that we can teach our young people. The idea of saying no. No to drugs, and no to alcoholic beverages, and no to immorality, and no to peer pressure, and no to any kind of dishonesty. We live in one of the most dangerous ages that anybody has ever lived in. And our young people need to be fortified. All of us need the same. But these are some ways that I believe, if we will accept them and abide by them, that we can keep from turning temptation into sin.
If you would like to learn more about God's Word with a free Bible correspondence course, then write us at Truth for the World, P.O. Box 5048, Duluth, Georgia, 30096, the United States of America, or visit us online at truthfortheworld.org. Truth for the World is a work of the Duluth Church of Christ in cooperation with churches of Christ throughout the world.
Day by day, and with each passing moment, strength I find to meet my trials here. Trusting in my Father's wise bestowment, I've no cause for worry or for fear. He whose heart is kind beyond all measure